Imagine a calling that changes everything. You are living your life with your plans and routines until a voice asks you something that seems impossible. Leave everything behind and go where I show you. This is the story of Abraham, the man who heard this voice and decided to obey, even without knowing exactly where it would lead him. In the Old Testament, he is known as the father of faith, someone who trusted God every step of the way. Abraham was not perfect, nor did he live a life free of challenges. He had moments of doubt and even made rash decisions. But what makes his story so inspiring is his willingness to trust, to start over, to hope when everyone around him might have said it was crazy to believe. He is proof that faith is not just a feeling, but a journey, sometimes with uncertain steps, but always with our eyes fixed on God. Today, I invite you to learn a little more about Abraham's life and what it can teach us about faith, obedience, and God's incredible ability to do the impossible. Each part of his story reveals something that we can apply to our own lives, whether in moments of joy, doubt, or trial. Let's explore this journey together and discover what made Abraham such a special and important figure in the Christian faith. But before we continue, if you are not yet a subscriber, subscribe to the channel and leave your like. Formerly called Abram, he lived in Ur of the Chaldeans, a prosperous and advanced city in the region that we now know as Iraq, near the Euphrates River. Ur was an important cultural and religious center, where life was quite established and people had their traditions and worship of local gods. Abram's family, like many around him, also followed these practices. Even so, God decided to reveal himself in a special way to him. In Genesis 12 verses 1-2, we read that God appeared to Abram and called him to leave his land, his relatives, and his father's house to go to a land that he would show him. This call from God was, to say the least, surprising. Imagine leaving behind everything you know, your home, your family, your culture, to follow a promise from God without even knowing your final destination. God's invitation was clear. Abram was to leave his comfort zone and trust in what was yet to come. God promised him not only a new land, but also that he would make him a great nation and that all the families of the earth would be blessed through him. Abram was a man of extraordinary faith, but he was almost 75 years old when he received this call, and up until that point, he and his wife Sarah had no children, which made the promise all the more challenging. What was most impressive about Abram's response was his immediate obedience. He didn't question, ask for guarantees, or try to negotiate details with God. He simply believed and set out, taking Sarah, his nephew Lot, and all his servants and possessions with him. He left the security of Ur to tread an uncertain path, guided only by God's promise. This act of faith by Abram is an inspiring example for us all. He did not know his final destination, but he trusted in the God who called him. By leaving Ur, Abram began a journey that would change not only his life, but the entire history of humanity. God began to fulfill his plan of redemption, choosing Abram to be the father of a people dedicated to him. Abram's journey teaches us that true faith involves trusting God even when the path is uncertain, and obeying his call even without seeing what lies ahead. Abram's courage and trust continue to be a powerful example of what it means to walk by faith, placing God's promise above any human security. In his journey of faith, Abram also faced difficult situations and moments of uncertainty. One such episode occurred when a severe famine struck the land, forcing him to seek sustenance elsewhere. The Bible records in Genesis 12 verse 10 that Abram went down to Egypt to sojourn there, because the famine was severe in the land. This decision shows us a human side of Abram. He, like any person, found himself in a risky situation and needed to take action to protect his family and possessions. However, the episode in Egypt reveals that even men of faith can have moments of insecurity and internal struggle. Upon entering Egypt, Abram faced a dilemma. Knowing that Sarah, his wife, was very beautiful, he feared that the Egyptians might kill him to have her. So he asked Sarah to say that she was his sister instead of his wife. Abram did not lie outright, since Sarah was his half-sister, Genesis 20 verse 12, but he intentionally omitted the truth to protect himself. In doing so, Abram tried, in a human way, to resolve what he feared was a threat to his life, without consulting God's guidance in this case. This episode brings to light an essential aspect of the walk of faith. Faith does not mean the absence of challenges or fears. Abraham had a moment of weakness, as any of us could have. Instead of trusting God fully to protect and provide for him, he acted on his own, which had consequences. The Egyptians, upon seeing Sarah, were truly enchanted by her, and Pharaoh himself took her into his palace, which could have ruined God's plan for the lineage promised to Abram. But even in the face of Abram's weakness, God intervened. The Lord sent plagues on Pharaoh and his household because of Sarah, revealing the truth to the king and causing Abram and his wife to be released and even rewarded to leave. This rescue by God shows his grace and faithfulness, even when Abraham failed to trust him completely. God honored his promise and protected Abraham and Sarah, ensuring that his plan for Abraham's life would not be interrupted. This episode teaches us that although faith is a path of growth and trust, it is normal for even those closest to God to have moments of doubt and make wrong choices. Abraham learned a valuable lesson. Trusting God must be a constant, even when circumstances seem difficult or threatening. This story reminds us that our security is in God and that we can trust him, even in times of uncertainty. Abraham grew through this time, and his story encourages us to do the same, knowing that God is faithful to guide and protect us, even when we fail ourselves. An episode that reveals a lot about Abram's character and his trust in God was the separation between him and his nephew Lot. In Genesis 13, we see that both Abraham and Lot had large flocks, tents, and servants. God's blessing on both was so great that the land where they were could no longer support so many animals and people at the same time, which led to conflicts between Abram's and Lot's herders. The situation was tense, and Abraham realized that he needed to find a peaceful solution to maintain family harmony and to testify before other peoples. In a gesture of great humility and generosity, Abram took the initiative and proposed an amicable separation, allowing Lot to choose the area where he wanted to settle. In Genesis 13 verses 8 to 9, Abram says, "Let there be no strife between me and you, or between my herders and your herders, for we are kinsmen. Is not the land before you? Please separate from me, for I am the Lord your God. If you go to the left, I will go to the right. If you go to the right, I will go to the left." This act of letting Lot choose first reveals Abraham's generous heart, which was not tied to material or personal advantage. He gave up his rights and demonstrated a peaceful spirit, trusting that God would take care of him wherever he went. Lot, given the freedom to choose, chose what seemed to be the best part of the land, the green plains of the Jordan Valley, near Sodom and Gomorrah, rich and well-watered regions. Lot's decision was based on what his eyes saw, and he did not consider the moral and spiritual implications of approaching these cities known for their wickedness. Abram, on the other hand, accepted with peace the rest of the land and remained in Canaan, a place that may have seemed less promising, but where he could count on God's presence and provision. This attitude of Abraham demonstrates a solid faith in God. He did not depend on circumstances or the best terrain to prosper. By entrusting the choice to Lot, he showed that his security came from his covenant with God and that he did not need to secure anything for himself. Abram was willing to give up what could have been an advantage in order not to compromise the peace and integrity of his family. And this faith was rewarded. Soon after the separation, God appeared to Abram and renewed his promise, guaranteeing him all the land he could see, and affirming that his descendants would be as numerous as the dust of the earth. Genesis 13 verses 14 to 17. Lot's separation marks an important point in Abram's journey, reaffirming that, for him, trust in God was above any earthly advantage. Abraham trusted that God would provide for him, regardless of the location or the immediate resources around him. This generosity and trust are an example to us that, when we put God first and do not depend solely on what our eyes see, we experience the peace and blessings that He has in store for us. Shortly after this, God makes a covenant with Abram in Genesis 15. This is undoubtedly one of the most significant moments in the patriarch's life and in biblical history. In this chapter, God not only reiterates his promise to give Abraham land and descendants, but also formalizes this promise through a sacred covenant, showing that his words are firm and unbreakable. The chapter begins with God comforting Abraham, saying, "Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield and your exceedingly great reward." Genesis 15 verse 1. Even though he had already received several promises, Abram still had doubts, especially regarding the promised descendants, since he and Sarah were still childless and advancing in age. Abram expresses his concern to God, asking, "O Lord God, what will you give me, since I go childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus?" Genesis 15 verse 2. He worries about not having a son to inherit his promises and possessions, fearing that his lineage would be extinguished with him. In response, God reassures Abram, reaffirming that he would indeed have a legitimate son who would be his heir. Then God leads Abraham out of the tent and shows him the starry sky, saying, "Look now toward heaven and count the stars, if you are able to number them." And he says, "So shall your descendants be." Genesis 15 verse 5. At that moment, Abram chooses to believe in the divine promise, even though it seems impossible. Abram's faith is considered so great that the Bible records, "And he believed in the Lord, and it was counted to him as righteousness." Genesis 15 verse 6. God recognized and honored Abraham's faith, which was considered righteousness, that is, a true and profound trust in the character and power of God. To formalize this promise, God instructs him to perform a covenant ritual according to ancient customs. He asks Abram to offer certain animals and cut them in half, placing the parts opposite each other. This ritual of cutting the animals symbolized a serious and irrevocable pact between the parties involved. Traditionally, both parties would pass among the animals, assuming responsibility for fulfilling the terms of the covenant. However, something extraordinary happens. While Abram sleeps, God, represented by a burning fire, passes alone among the animals, assuming full responsibility for the promise. In doing so, God shows that this covenant is unconditional. He commits himself to Abram unilaterally, guaranteeing that he himself will fulfill the promise, regardless of human actions. This highlights the nature of God's grace, which is free and not dependent on human merit. In Genesis 15 verse 18 we read, "On that same day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, 'To your descendants I have given this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river Euphrates.'" God assures Abraham that his descendants will inherit the land of Canaan, and he delimits the boundaries of that land. God's covenant with Abraham shows us God's unwavering commitment to fulfilling his promises. Even when the time seemed long or the promise seemed distant, God reassured Abraham that he was faithful and trustworthy. Through this covenant, Abram learned to trust God even more and to understand that his promises did not depend on favorable circumstances, but on God's faithfulness. This covenant points to the relationship between God and his people throughout the Bible, culminating in the New Testament, where we see the fulfillment of many of these promises in Jesus Christ, a descendant of Abram, who brings blessings to all nations. This eternal covenant made with Abram continues to inspire people of faith today, reminding us that we can trust God even when his promises seem far away. Like Abram, we are called to walk in faith, trusting that God is faithful and that his promises, whether to a nation or to each of us, are unbreakable. In Genesis 16, we see the impact of human impatience in the face of God's promise. Although Abram was a man of faith, both he and Sarah began to doubt the possibility of having a child, as they were already advanced in age and the promise seemed increasingly unlikely. Sarah, in particular, felt pressured by the inability to conceive and, in a moment of desperation, decided to take matters into her own hands. As the years passed, the promise seemed increasingly distant, and Sarah began to wonder if she herself was the obstacle to God's promise being fulfilled. Determined to help the divine plan come to fruition, she suggests that Abram have a child with her Egyptian servant, Hagar. She tells Abram, "The Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Please take my servant. Perhaps I will have children by her." Genesis 16 verse 2. This type of arrangement was culturally acceptable at the time, where a servant could serve as a surrogate mother in cases of a wife's infertility. Abraham agrees to the plan, and Hagar conceives a son. The decision, however, soon brings conflict. When Hagar realizes that she is pregnant, she begins to despise Sarah, her mistress, which creates an atmosphere of tension and bitterness. Sarah then begins to treat Hagar harshly, to the point that Hagar runs away into the desert. At that moment, God intervened, and an angel found Hagar and promised that her son, Ishmael, would also be the father of a great nation, but that his life would be marked by conflict. Genesis 16 verses 10 to 12. The birth of Ishmael, however, did not represent the fulfillment of the promise made by God. Ishmael was the result of human impatience, an attempt to carry out God's plan through one's own hasty methods. This episode shows us that even great men and women of faith have moments of weakness and doubt. Abraham and Sarah wanted to see the promise come true, but in their haste they ended up making decisions that would bring lasting consequences and conflicts. The impatience of Sarah and Abram teaches us about the importance of waiting for God's time. Waiting can often be uncomfortable and even painful, especially when the situation seems hopeless and the promise seems distant. But this episode is a warning that trying to force God's plan can lead to undesirable results and consequences that we do not always understand at the time. At the same time, the birth of Ishmael also reveals to us God's love and mercy. Even though he was the result of a hasty decision, Ishmael was not rejected by God. He also received a promise of blessing and protection, and God took care of him and his mother, Hagar. This attitude of God shows that he is capable of transforming even human mistakes and failures into opportunities to act with grace and mercy. The central lesson of this episode is that, while God is faithful in fulfilling his promises, we are called to trust in his timing and his way of acting. Waiting is part of the process of maturing faith, and learning to rest in God's timing is a challenge that requires patience and submission. Abraham's journey continues, and he will still see that God has not forgotten his promise and that, despite deviations and failures, the divine plan is fulfilled perfectly. In Genesis 17, God reaffirms his covenant with Abram and establishes circumcision as the visible sign of this covenant between himself and the people who would come from Abram's descendants. This covenant had already been made in Genesis 15, when God promised Abram a land and numerous descendants, but now, in Genesis 17, he expands and confirms the promise, including a physical symbol as a constant reminder of the sacred union. In this chapter, God appears to Abraham, who is now 99 years old, and declares that he will change his name from Abram to Abraham, which means father of multitudes. This new name symbolized God's promise that he would be the ancestor of nations and kings. Genesis 17 verses 5 to 6. This name change was a way of marking Abraham's new status and the great responsibility he would have as the father of a people who would be set apart for God. Circumcision was instituted as an outward, physical sign for all males who were part of Abraham's line of descent. God said, "This is my covenant, which you shall keep, between me and you and your descendants after you. Every male among you shall be circumcised." Genesis 17 verse 10. This act was much more than a cultural rite of passage. It was a commitment to God that was to be passed down from generation to generation. Circumcision represented the purity and separation of God's people from other peoples. It was like a seal of identification, affirming that they were part of a unique and eternal covenant with the Creator. The spiritual significance of circumcision is also profound. It symbolized the need to remove the excess and impurity of the heart, a concept that God himself would later explain. In Deuteronomy 10 verse 16 we read, "Therefore circumcise the foreskin of your heart, and do not be stiff-necked any longer." Although circumcision was a physical mark, God intended this act to reflect an inner transformation, a heart willing to obey and follow His will. Physical circumcision was only the beginning. The real covenant God sought was with the heart. Abraham responded with immediate faith and obedience. As soon as God established circumcision as a sign of the covenant, Abraham circumcised himself, his son Ishmael, and all the men in his household. Genesis 17 verses 23 to 27. This readiness to obey shows Abraham's commitment to God and his willingness to follow God's instructions, even when they were challenging. He did not question or hesitate, but carried out God's command that very day. This act was a testament to his faith, loyalty, and submission to God's plan. Circumcision also had implications for the identity of God's people. Those who were circumcised were considered covenant members and part of God's chosen people. This covenant of circumcision would be remembered by all future generations as a visible connection between God and Abraham's people. Abraham's covenant and obedience point to a faith that transcends ritual and involves the heart. Rather than an outward sign, what matters now is a transformed life marked by faith in Christ and a covenant of love with God. Abraham's circumcision, then, is not just an isolated act in history. It is a symbol of deep commitment to God, reminding us of the importance of living in accordance with His purposes and keeping our identity grounded in His promises. Sarah's reaction is telling, and Sarah laughed within herself, saying, "After I have grown old, shall I have pleasure, my Lord being old also?" Genesis 18 verse 12. This laughter is a mixture of incredulity and skepticism, showing how challenging the situation was for her. Human nature often questions what seems impossible, and this moment is a reflection of Sarah's internal struggle between faith and doubt. However, God answers directly and clearly, stating, "Is anything too hard for the Lord?" Genesis 18 verse 14. This rhetorical question is a powerful reminder that for God, nothing is impossible. He is the creator of the universe and has the power to accomplish His plans in ways that surpass our comprehension. The promise of Isaac's birth is not just a matter of conception, but a testament to God's ability to fulfill His promises in any circumstance. The fulfillment of this promise is vital to the story of salvation. Isaac would not be just a son to Abraham and Sarah. He would be the fulfillment of God's covenant and the beginning of a great nation. Through Isaac, God would continue the lineage that would lead to the people of Israel, who in turn would be the channel for the coming of the Messiah. This connection between Isaac and future redemption is fundamental to understanding God's purpose in history. Genesis 18 verses 23 to 33 reveals a profound aspect of Abraham's character, his compassion and courage. Upon learning that God planned to destroy these cities because of their immorality and corruption, Abraham did not hesitate to approach the Lord to intercede on their behalf. "Will you destroy the righteous with the wicked?" Genesis 18 verse 23. Abraham asks. This question is filled with a deep concern for God's justice and the possibility that, even in the midst of wickedness, there were righteous people who could be spared. Abraham argues with God, insisting that if there were 50 righteous people in the city, God would not destroy it. And so he reduces the number from 50 to 45, then to 40, and so on until he reaches 10 righteous people. This intimate dialogue between Abraham and God is not only an example of intercession, but also a model for how we should relate to God. Abraham showed that intercession is an act of faith and responsibility. He cared about others and was willing to act, even when it meant putting himself at risk. It is important to pray not only for ourselves, but also for others, especially those who are lost or living in sin. Abraham's courage in confronting God with questions and his insistence on seeking mercy in the midst of judgment remind us that we should always cry out for divine grace, even when the situation seems hopeless. In this way, Abraham becomes an example of how intercession can make a difference, reflecting God's love and compassion for all humanity. Then, finally, one of the most exciting and significant moments in the lives of Abraham and Sarah takes place. The birth of Isaac, symbolizing God's faithfulness in fulfilling his promises, even when everything seemed impossible. In Genesis 21 verses 1-3, Scripture tells us, "Then the Lord visited Sarah as he had promised, and the Lord did to Sarah as he had promised. And Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age, at the time God had promised him." After years of waiting and doubt, God's promise to Abraham is miraculously fulfilled. Sarah, who was 90 years old, and Abraham, who was 100, now experienced the joy and fulfillment of seeing what seemed impossible become reality. Isaac is not just a son. He is the manifestation of God's power and his ability to accomplish what he promises, regardless of the circumstances. The name Isaac, which means laughter, is loaded with symbolism. Sarah's initial disbelief, who had laughed upon hearing God's promise, now turns into laughter of joy and celebration. When Isaac is born, Sarah says, "God has made me laugh, and everyone who hears this will laugh with me." Genesis 21 verse 6. This transformation of laughter is a testament to God's redemptive work, which transforms doubt into joy and waiting into celebration. Isaac's birth also reaffirms the importance of faith. Abraham and Sarah faced many challenges and, at times, even tried to help God fulfill his promise, such as when Sarah offered her servant Hagar to Abraham. However, the story teaches us that patience and trust in God's timing are crucial. What God has promised, he will fulfill in his own time. Furthermore, Isaac represents the continuation of God's covenant with Abraham. Through him, Abraham's descendants will multiply, and the promises made to him will extend for generations. Isaac is, therefore, the starting point for the fulfillment of the divine plan that would culminate in the formation of the people of Israel and, eventually, the coming of the Messiah. This event also challenges us to reflect on our own lives. Often, we may feel that our hopes are lost or that God's promises are unattainable. However, the story of Isaac reminds us that, for God, nothing is impossible. He can bring to life what we consider dead or hopeless. When we look at the birth of Isaac, we are encouraged to trust in God's promises and to believe that even in our most desperate situation, God can perform miracles. Thus, the birth of Isaac is a celebration of God's faithfulness, a reaffirmation that he is able to fulfill his promises, and an invitation to faith. It is a reminder that when we wait on the Lord, we can experience the joy of seeing our dreams and hopes come true, for God always fulfills what he promises. When Isaac is born and the years pass, God tests Abraham's faith in a way that at first seems incomprehensible. After these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, "Abraham." And he said to him, "Here I am." Then God said, "Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah. Offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains that I will show you." Imagine the scene. Abraham, a man of deep faith, receives a command from God that would challenge him to give away what he loves most. Isaac, the son of promise, the one who symbolized the fulfillment of God's promises, now becomes the object of a sacrifice. How could Abraham understand this? What would he do with the pain and despair that God's command brought him? Abraham's response is surprising. Without hesitation, he prepares to carry out God's command. He raises the knife and, in an act of obedience that defies human logic, is ready to sacrifice his son. This willingness reveals the depth of his faith and trust in God. He believed that even if Isaac were to be sacrificed, God could raise him up, Hebrews 11 verse 19. This moment culminates when, at the last moment, God intervenes and says, "Do not lay a hand on the boy or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." Genesis 22 verse 12. God provides a ram caught by its horns, which Abraham sacrifices in Isaac's place. This act not only shows God's grace and provision, but it is also a powerful symbol of the sacrifice that would come to be made by Jesus Christ, the Son of God. The sacrifice of Isaac is a preamble to what will happen in the new covenant. Just as Abraham was called to sacrifice his only son, God gave his only son, Jesus, for the redemption of humanity. Abraham's obedience not only tested his faith, but also pointed to the greater story of salvation that would be revealed in Scripture. It is an invitation to reflect on our own lives and to be willing to put our faith into practice, even when it seems impossible or painful. True faith can require sacrifice, and following God often involves giving up what we love. However, just as God provided for Abraham, He also provides for us. The deeper lesson here is that faith is not just passive belief. It is action that manifests itself in obedience, even in the face of the greatest trials. When we face challenges in our life of faith, we are reminded that God sees and knows our hearts. Abraham's test was not only a test of his devotion, but an invitation to trust in a God who always has a greater purpose and who is always ready to intervene on our behalf. It is not only a story of faith, but also a powerful testimony of God's providence, who never abandons us and who, in His perfect plan, has already made the greatest provision of all: salvation through Jesus Christ. Abraham's life is an extraordinary testimony to the journey of faith, filled with challenges, tests, and divine promises. Through his obedience and unwavering trust in God, we are inspired to cultivate a deep relationship with the Creator, even in the face of uncertainty and difficulty. Each step Abraham took teaches us that faith is not just a feeling, but an action that requires courage and determination. As we look at his story, we are reminded of the importance of trusting in God's promises, regardless of the circumstances. It encourages us to believe that, like him, we are also invited to be part of a greater plan, where faith becomes the foundation of our lives and where divine intervention is always a reality. May we, like Abraham, walk with faith and determination, knowing that God is faithful and keeps His promises.